back to Progressively Incorrect. I am your host, Dr. Zach Groeschel. Today I'm thrilled to be speaking with Meg Lee and Jim Heel, two educators at the cutting edge of evidence-based education. They're going to be talking to us about the work they're doing to scale the science of learning up and across this fine country through their Learning Science Consortium. Let's hope it takes off because it feels sometimes like we're paddling upstream compared to our friends in the UK and Australia. This podcast is brought to you by John Catt Educational, which publishes some of the best books in education. This week, I'd like to do one more plug for the book Responsive Coaching by Josh Goodrich, mainly because it's amazing. Josh has written a book that perfectly addresses the issues I've had as an instructional coach. It outlines a practical, efficient, and accountable approach to instructional coaching that just makes so much sense. This is one of the best books I've read in 2024, and I highly recommend you check it out. Did you know that I support schools nationwide and internationally to develop their instructional frameworks based on the ideas I talk about every week on this podcast? If you're looking for high-quality professional development on cognitive load theory, explicit instruction, and science of learning topics, please don't hesitate to send me a message through my contact page, which is linked in the show notes. We can meet on Zoom and put together a plan that moves your school forward. Now, without further ado, let's roll the tape of my discussion with two of the leading change makers in education, Meg Lee and Jim Heel. Welcome back, everyone. Hi, Jim. Hi, Meg. How are you both doing?
Great. Nice to be here, Zach.
Great to be here, Zach. Excited to have this conversation.
Me too. This is one of those I've been waiting for a while, actually, because I see you two as sort of like big change agents in the space that I'm really interested in education. We're going to be talking about learning science. We're going to be talking about evidence-informed practices. Super exciting. I know a lot of the folks listening in right now know you from other things that they're involved in, research ed and research Fred and so on. So yeah, it's great to see you both on this Zoom call. Let's start with introductions. How about you introduce yourself and what you do and sort of in just a few sentences. Jim, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure thing. So Jim Heel, I wear a few hats, Zach, actually. So this is a sort of a multi-sided way of describing what I do. I am a professor of evidence-informed educational leadership at the Academic University of Applied Sciences in Amsterdam. I live not in Amsterdam or in Europe, but on the other side of the pond, just outside Boston. I work for a non-profit here called Deans for Impact, that some of the listeners may have heard from, and they work to infuse learning science principles into the way that we prepare and continually develop teachers. And then my third hat is I teach a class at the Harvard Graduate School of Education on teaching and learning, and I also write books about this work. So I was a co-author of How Teaching Happens with Carl Hendrick and Paul Kirshner, and I have some more books coming out later this year and into next that we can talk about in due course.
Perfect. And listeners, if you'd like to go back and listen to Paul Kirshner's episode where he talks about how learning and how teaching happens. Also, Carl Hendrick was just on the podcast talking about research ed. So, lots of good content there. Meg, how about you introduce yourself?
Well, thanks, Zach. I am 29 years in public education, and my background is I was an English teacher and a professional learning specialist, and then a school-based leader, and then a system leader. And I'm currently in charge of the learning for the adults in my district as director of organizational development. So my district, Frederick County Public Schools, is a rapidly growing district of about 49,000 students and 7,000 employees. And over the last decade, we've moved to become an equity-driven, evidence-informed district. And I've had the real honor and pleasure to help lead that work along with some exceptional educators in our district. In addition, along the path, I wrote a book for parents called Mindsets for Parents with Mary Kay Ritchie, New York Times bestselling author. And we were able to write a second edition of that book that came out in 2023, where we were able to lens it through an evidence-informed lens and talk about what people get right about mindset and what people get wrong about mindset, and how it is much more nuanced and not as simple to implement, particularly for teachers, but also for parents and families. And my other hat is that I work closely with Tom Bennett and teams of educators here in the United States to help forward the movement of research ed here in the US. And so those are the hats that I wear currently.
Excellent. That's perfect. And we've all met at different things, different conferences, Festival of Education, Research at Greenwich that just happened. And these are all around sort of the science of learning or learning science. So here's my first question for you. And we can keep going with Meg if that's okay. How did you first get into learning science, and how has your professional journey been shaped by it?
Wow, that's an amazing question. I think for me, it really started with having a real lifelong, career long interest in how people learn. And I found myself as a teacher always working at the edges of exceptionality. I was really dedicated to working with students with special educational needs early in my career. And then when I became a system leader, I worked a lot with advanced academics and students who are gifted and talented and sometimes even twice exceptional. And I had a lot of curiosity around how people learn. And I also had a lot of curiosity around motivation. So especially as a school-based administrator, I really wondered, and I spent my career largely in middle schools, and that's really an area where you want to tap into the motivation and interest of kids. But I also was really interested in what made learning happen. And so I sort of was introduced to mind brain education and the science of learning about a decade ago. And my work in the space has evolved since that time. Thankfully, I was able to connect with some great friends and colleagues at Center for Transformative Teaching and Learning. And then after that, through my own study and reading and research, and then through meeting wonderful colleagues, both here in the United States and around the world, who have expanded my thinking. And then I think the other thing that's really happened for me is watching what it looks like to actually move practices grounded in the evidence of how people learn forward in a large context of educators, and how much teachers appreciate both the professional expertise that they gain when they think about learning science, but also the fact that we can better streamline what really works in the classroom and what doesn't, and hopefully be able to take something off our teachers' plates to give them more time to do the things that make the most difference for our kids. And so this has really changed my practice as I look back on things I did in the classroom with my 7th and 8th grade students that I loved so much. I recognize that many of the things that worked well for me worked because they were very aligned with the way people learn and what we know now about learning and how the brain works. But there are also other practices that I would never do again now that I know what the evidence says. And so it's been a great journey for me. And part of that journey has been connecting with somebody like Jim, who shares a lot of my enthusiasm and passion for moving the work forward and actually making a difference in schools and in higher education, and helping teachers and ultimately helping our students.
Yeah, Jim, what about you? Like the first time I even saw your name actually was I got my free copy of How Teaching Happens, and I was like, wait a second,
Yeah,
who's
yeah,
this person, and that was the first time. But then, of course, Deans for Impact, the Science of Learning Guide, and all of those papers have been like so important to this school. Yeah, your turn.
yeah. No, absolutely. Well, as you can probably tell from my accent, I did not grow up in the United States, even though I live here now, and my children do not share the accent that I am currently employing on this podcast. But nevertheless, I grew up and grew up as a teacher as well, if you will, in the UK. I was a classroom teacher and an administrator in the UK for over a decade. And over the span of that time, the only way that I can describe it was the feeling of something kind of niggling me, that there was something amiss in the way that I was being prepared as a teacher in the first place before I entered the classroom. As a novice teacher, I felt that. As a teacher with maybe 3, 4, 5 years under my belt, I felt that. And as an administrator, I began to see that ever more prominently. And in short, it started to become almost a bit of a stone in my shoe. I couldn't quite work out why the kinds of noises that we were making about what we wanted to be true for students and student learning was not necessarily commensurate with the types of moves that teachers were making in classrooms. And so I sort of started to bang this drum and continued to bang it for well over sort of 3, 4, 5 years in my sort of final phase of my life in the UK. What then happened was I was able to move to the US just over 10 years ago now. I moved here with my wife, who I'd met while I was over here doing some research, and we ended up after a couple of years in the UK moving back to the US. And I kind of shamelessly used that just as an opportunity to kind of press the reset button and say, if I could go back in time and retool myself in ways that would allow me to be a better teacher, a better leader, a better educator, full stop, what would be some of those things? And so I went back to school. I did my master's and my doctorate at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And it was as though those dots that I had been wanting to connect started to finally come into place. And I know a lot of people that we work with in this regard have this sense of almost kind of a kind of yearning regret of saying, why didn't I know about this stuff earlier? Think of all the students and kids I could have better helped along the way. And I must admit, I did have a tinge of that, but more prominent than that was the feeling that I absolutely don't want this to be true for any teacher in the future. And so, for the fullest extent possible, how could it be the case that we both prepare and continue to develop teachers in ways commensurate with what we understand about how learning and teaching happen? And that is what took me to Deans for Impact. I straight out of my doctorate, I had the chance to sit down with them and was asked a similar question to the one that you just asked me. And when I finished speaking about 10 minutes later, they said, well, you've just described the mission of our organization. And so it was a beautiful fit from my perspective, in that I think at the time, and to a certain extent, this could well still be the case, that as a nonprofit working directly with higher education, with an explicit focus on learning science, including gathering data, putting out, as you mentioned earlier, usable, accessible guides and white papers for the field that says this is what we mean when we talk about the learning sciences, and this is how they can be applied within instructional contexts. And continuing to do that work. Deans for Impact itself is coming up on its 10-year anniversary. And in that time, we've worked with, I think, nearly 200 universities around the United States. And now, as I know we're going to touch on in due course, beginning increasingly to work in the K-12 space as well. But with this continuous drumbeat of it's the evidence, it's the science, it's understanding how the mind works, because how can we even pretend to know how to teach unless we know what learning looks like?
Perfect. And you are both intimately familiar with how complex this whole thing is. Like, a lot of people listening right now, email me and say your show is the only thing I have going that aligns with my journey. They tell me that Twitter, some spaces on Twitter are completely different than their day-to-day jobs in schools, and my principal it has these demands, and my district and central office leaders, they think this way, and they're not incentivized to think about these things. And so you're here to really talk about applying learning science to systems. So we have this new idea that just came about recently, and it's starting to grow, the Learning Science Consortium. How did it come about, and what are its aims? Meg, let's go back to you.
Well, I had the real exciting opportunity to meet Jim several years ago, and hear about his work with Deans for Impact. And of course, I had utilized their resources for years. So they were already a trusted partner in my world. And then quickly, Jim became a trusted partner as well. And we started talking a lot about some of the challenges that our district was facing as trying to be an evidence-informed public school district in a context where we were very fortunate that our higher education partners were very interested in joining us in the work. And so I think sometimes we hear a lot of negativity around higher ed and their unwillingness to move. That wasn't my experience at all. In fact, our higher ed partners wanted to be on the learning journey with us, and were very interested in how they could partner with us. And so talking to Jim, I thought, let's see what this could possibly look like. And over the course of several months and lots of conversations, we realized that we kind of were asking ourselves the same questions, one of which was, why is it that we look at the school systems that receive beginning teachers and help to prepare them through their student teaching experiences and their internships and their higher ed experiences as sort of separate entities? And we don't talk about what are the things that kind of bring them together. And what if we could sort of coalesce around learning science and develop some through lines so that we were talking the same language, that we were preparing the novice teachers and supporting them when they came into our schools. And that was one of the things that I kept wondering about in teacher ed prep, which was it would be great if ed prep was aligned to learning science, but if those candidates go into public and districts or private schools and institutions that are not aligned with learning science, what happens? Then those people are kind of on their own. And so we really loved this idea of could we design something that would actually allow this to happen? And that's what we decided to do. So Jim, you take it away with sort of how that noodling around and the idea kind of came about.
Yeah, so to go back in time a little bit further, we conducted a study at Deans for Impact a few years ago where we actually have a learning science assessment tool that we use to determine the extent to which teachers understand and can apply learning science principles to their practice. And it's been a really powerful tool for us because it enables us to just get a temperature check of where an educator is in their sort of capacity to recognize how these powerful principles could be applied to good effect. And we've used this tool across a range of different contexts and with many different educators. But we actually did one study in the UK whereby we worked with Teach First, and we had the good fortune to be able to survey over 5,000 trainee teachers and the mentors with whom they were working most closely. And on the whole, the mentors were obviously more experienced. They had, on average, been in the classroom for around about 5 years as an average. And when we crunched the data, when you're kind of surprised and unsurprised at the same time, which was to say, when you looked at it, the comparison between the teachers who were freshly new into the profession and had just completed their teacher training year, when compared to the teachers that had been in the classroom for around 5 years on average, those more experienced teachers who were supposedly mentoring those novice teachers fared no better on that assessment than the novice teachers they were purportedly there to support. And so the notion that you cannot teach what you don't know, and you can and in order to coach someone towards growth and improvement, you need to have incredibly rich domain specific understanding, was already something that was kind of leaving me quite seriously concerned. And so I started something of a kind of a covert campaign at Deans for Impact that quickly became an overt campaign at Deans for Impact to say, look, we need to acknowledge, and this is picking up from Meg's thread, we need to acknowledge that the teacher that is partway through their teacher training year and the teacher who is 6, 8, 12, 18 months into their first school appointment is the same human being with the same challenges, the same, and I mean this in the most generous of senses, the same shortcomings that we all would love to be able to address. And from there came this kernel of an idea that said, well, instead of those two systems of preparation and continued development being seen as living in separate worlds, what indeed would happen if we got an educator preparation program and a K-12 school district, specifically a K-12 school district to which they were sending those trainees? What if we got them into the same room at the same time? And what if we used the language of learning science and the and evidence-informed approaches as the kind of common currency of that realm? And that was kind of where it started. Now, from there, as Meg will I'm sure testify, having the idea and then getting the wheels in motion to make something like that happen was not as easy as one might first think. And we quickly realized that there's a reason why higher ed and K-12 don't necessarily always collaborate on things. And it's not necessarily just to do with kind of anything ad hominem or any kind of mistrust between those two systems. It's just that they're not organized in such a way to make it so, until someone like Meg can come along and clear the path to make it happen. So, you have to think of everything from how to free up people's time and ensure that they are compensated and covered for the time that they give up. You need to make a considered analysis of the kind of the incentives and motivations that might be in some cases similar between higher ed and K-12, and in other cases different. And you need to be able to sell it. You need to be able to sell it on the merits of saying this is for the good of the teachers that we're putting out into the world. And if we can get aligned and we can use these powerful principles to support them and to continue to support them, then there's an absolute good in that. And so it took the best part of a year, probably more than a year, from original kind of kernel of the idea to then the realization. And on the first time that we came together, which was in September of last year, correct, Meg?
Yes.
You sometimes do this cheesy thing when you start a training, and you say, put your hands up if you are involved in this, or you're from this part of the country, and put your hands up if you're, wherever. We were able to say, okay, supervisors, hands in the air, principals / assistant principals, hands in the air, field-based organizers of where to send these candidates and how to get their hands in the air, mentors and whatever, faculty. Now, put your hand in the air if you are in some way responsible for either preparing or continuing to develop a teacher, and every hand goes in the air. And for me and for Meg, even in that moment, before we'd even opened our mouths to actually begin exploring the kinds of questions and principles that we wanted to examine, that already felt like a victory. So that was how we got to where to day one, as it were. But Meg, I could kick it back to you, because I wonder if there's anything else that you're interested in naming in terms of the various paths that needed to be cleared, or egos that needed to be massaged, or any other means of creating the conditions for something like this to even get off the ground in the first place.
I think it's just it was not as difficult as it could have been, because we had such great partners. We are working with Hood College, who is a wonderful partner here in Frederick, that they do almost all of their placements with us exclusively. And so while they're not our only higher ed partner, they're certainly a very significant one. And that faculty had been very interested in the work that we were doing in evidence-informed practice and learning science. In fact, they had engaged with me in a book study on how learning happens already. So they were really excited about taking the next step with us. But Jim's right that we were having a pinch me moment, the two of us, to see everyone in the room together, because it does take a long time to move the wheels of progress in large organizations, whether they're higher ed or whether they're K-12 school systems. And it took effort on the part of a lot of people. So from curriculum developers to our principals and our assistant principals, to our grants department, to figuring out, like, how could we do this where we really weren't taking people away from classroom time with our children for very long? How could we honor their time by compensating them if they were going to stay with us? And I remember our consortium runs from 1:30 to 6:30 when we meet. And I remember the first time we got together, it was just the energy in the room was fantastic. And it was still fantastic at 5:30. And someone came up to me and said, you know, I really didn't think this was going to work, Meg. When I saw that timeline, I thought this is going to be a disaster. And I said, well, we did that on purpose because we wanted teachers to be away from their kids the least amount of time possible. It means they don't have to write a lot of sub plans. It means we don't take our excellent educators out of our classrooms. We were also lucky in that the interns from the college program were actually serving as the substitutes while their mentor teachers were in the consortium. But just the energy in the room. And I think it's a commitment to learning and a commitment to growth. And we were fortunate to have that. And that energy behind us really helped get us started on the journey.
It's interesting. You both sort of mentioned that you maybe a little bit of pushback against what I thought, which was that these two groups of folks, the K-12 space and the higher ed space, they don't talk to each other. I guess I always thought it was sort of for some nefarious reason, you know, like I just thought like the higher ed people just really look down on teachers, and so on.
And I don't want to say they never talk to each other. They do talk to each other. I mean, we do have collaborative conversations, and we have for years. But to put these large groups of people who all have a stake in the game in the room together to talk about instructional practice, that is a bit of a difference than talking about how we're going to place interns, or like this was a focus on how are we going to truly live out being equity driven and evidence informed. And where does that live? It lives in the practice of daily instruction in our classrooms. And what does that look like? And what does that look like when you're a faculty member teaching in a higher ed setting as you have pre-service teachers? And what does that look like when you are working in a classroom as a mentor teacher, modeling for your intern? And how does that look when you're an internship supervisor coming in to observe a student teacher? And how does that look when you're an administrator who's coaching new teachers, or you're an induction leader who's coaching new teachers? That was just a very different way of looking at that collaboration, Zach.
Wow. And I mean, I think we've learned a few things from kind of the growth in the in England specifically, and it's kind of cool that Jim's here to to see, he's seen kind of the progress that's been made there. But I mean, how do you avoid some of the common pitfalls, like for example, making sure this doesn't become a partisan, like a right wing versus left wing thing? How do you make sure that this doesn't become that the teachers have a voice in this, and that they're not essentially prescribed or directed to do things that in the end of the day don't actually scale into classrooms? I'm just curious about all these things.
Yeah, I think part of what you're teeing up here is in fact part of a new book that we're working on, Carl and Paul Kirshner and I, along with one of our colleagues from Academica. What we're trying to do with this book is to explore the notion that there are a lot of seeming paradoxes in the education space. So I can give you an example, and I think it speaks to what you were naming about how do you avoid this kind of small p politicization. Let's take something like teacher-led instruction versus student-centered learning. And the idea that from 50,000 feet, not only is that a dichotomy that many of us would recognize, but dare I say it, it is a dichotomy that in no small part may even say more than just how you believe about pedagogy, but it might mistakenly communicate something closer to your philosophy or maybe even your politics. And I just think that is does a complete disservice to what we're trying to do as educators. What you actually notice when you actually look close up at what we mean by moments in an instructional scenario where the teacher is taking the lead versus moments in an instructional scenario when students are being invited to wield knowledge and make their own sense of things, is that they're just, those two monikers, teacher-led and student-centered, they're just lazy bumper stickers that have very little to do with something, the act of teaching, which is just almost immeasurably complex and nuanced. And so not only has that been a topic that we have been thinking about a lot, and the book is going to try and, in turn, take a number of those different seeming paradoxes and unpack them in such a way to show that, there's more to them than meets the eye. But also coming back to your question about how that was fashioned in our work with Frederick and Hood, I think the lesson lies in the degree to which you are able to acknowledge the nuance and invite those around you to acknowledge the nuance. So one decision that we made very early on was that we weren't going to try and boil the ocean and cover, 25 different models of the mind. But rather, we were going to spend an entire year concentrating on a single aspect of learning science. Some might even argue this is kind of like a sub-aspect of learning science. But essentially, what we said was, if we know that the more deeply and meaningfully and effortfully a student thinks about a given idea, the more likely it is to be encoded into their long-term memory for future use and retrieval, then it behooves us as teachers to be able to ask questions, create tasks, offer prompts, and generally place students in a position in which they are being invited to think effortfully, deeply, and meaningfully about content. So like a really straightforward example of this that we sort of sometimes use when introducing some of these basic topics to the uninitiated is, let's say you asked a student a question, how many legs does a spider have? Versus you ask a student a question, in what ways is a spider not an insect? Right? Now, even with just a straight, that's just in question formulation, right? But you could imagine how many tributaries run off of something like that to think, okay, if this is a demonstration of the different ways in which we can prompt and probe students to justify their thinking, offer their rationale, connect what they know to what they might come to know, but all in service of this question of depth of processing. That was what was at the heart of it. That spanned an entire year, which meant that we could reasonably build shared understanding of that concept, but have it be actually robust and nuanced rather than just skating over it in a hot 5 seconds and moving on. We were also able to then work out ways in which we could infuse it into the existing practices, both at Hood College and at Frederick County. So one of the things that we did was invite everyone in the room, again, at a voluntary basis, because there's some aspects of the way that you do general practice that, you know, you don't want sort of unions up in arms if you're telling people that they need to change certain ways of doing what they do. But at a voluntary basis, we said, look, what if you worked with us to revise the observational rubrics that you use when you are walking into a classroom to observe a novice teacher, to incorporate and infuse some aspects of this effortful thinking that we've been doing over the last few months? What would it look like if we layered that in? Okay, that gets you a little further down the track. Now, what about the coaching conversation? You've had the chance to observe the teacher. How would an appreciation of, in this case, effortful thinking, transform the manner in which you are inviting them to pay attention to what it is that they're doing in the day to day? And so we really wanted to move from this place of, I know it and I understand it at a conceptual level. I know it when I see it. In other words, I can recognize when it is or it is not happening, and indeed to the extent to which it's happening. And I can help others to improve in relation to it. And I don't think you get any of those things if you just pay short shrift to the concepts, the principles, the evidence. And further still, I think if you pay short shrift to it, then you do increase the likelihood that people may retreat into their pedagogical corners and say, well, you know, I don't really believe in that. And which begs the question, well, what's the that? Like, what would it look like to really understand the that? And in my experience, more often than not, the more you understand the underlying architecture of these concepts, they become a lot less hairy and scary and divisive than tweets and threads and, you know, Twitter spats might have you believe.
You know, but I'm just thinking, like, where I'm sitting now, and I'm at a school, like, and a school leader's listening to this, they're going, like, when is someone going to approach me with this work, right? Because honestly, I'm powerless at this point to make any change. My rubric, I don't really think it's that great, but we've got to use it. Or we don't have a model of the mind that I can show to teachers. I've got to carve out some time and do something, and they're all going to associate it with me. They're not going to associate it with really what other people have written and found out. I guess, like, you know, as you work through this, what are your thoughts about scaling this up even greater, and what kind of work would be needed to spread this even farther?
I think that's really, that was part of our thinking from the very beginning, Zach, was that yes, we knew that we were in a position because of where Jim works and where I work, and the missions between our organizations, that we could see this becoming a prototype, but that it didn't need to stop with just what we were doing. And so we really were thinking about this from the beginning as, what is our theory of change and what is sort of our proof of concept that this works? And the exciting thing is that based on the decisions that Jim outlined that we made early on, we were able to really collect valuable data along the way to track what was changing among the participants in our Learning Science Consortium. And it's really what separates what we're doing from what a lot of people are talking about, in that we're actually seeing the change on the ground. And I am hearing from teachers who are participants in this consortium who are saying, I realized by the second session that my students were not thinking effortfully, that I thought they were, but that it was not equitable for everyone in the classroom, that I did not have a way to make sure that, students whose responses weren't solicited directly by me were actually thinking about the question, that I didn't realize that there were some students who were being completely left out of the thinking process, that they were going to be changing some of their strategies as a result, that they were thinking about routines where students could actually think independently about questions and then have opportunities to converse with each other before sharing out, and that they were becoming more independent. And so we actually saw not just in their understanding of the concepts moving, and that was through their careful analysis of lesson examples that we had them do both pre and post consortium. So, looking at actual lessons to see how effortful do you think they are, and where do you see these eliciting thinking, to actually having them watch videos of classroom scenarios and having them identify, is effortful thinking happening in this scenario? For whom is it happening? How frequently is it happening? Is it targeted? Is it effortful? What kinds of thinking are required of the students? And so by collecting that data, we were able to show that the work that we did has moved our participants along a continuum to a greater extent than I believe Jim and I even thought we would see. And the implications in the classrooms are so significant that I have administrators saying things to me like, Meg, I used to go into classrooms of master teachers and think, I don't even know what feedback to give because this lesson's just great. But now when I go into the lesson, I'm thinking, that was good, but the kids weren't all thinking. So there's a real equity problem here because this was not effortful thinking for everyone. And now I actually have something I can talk about and some strategies I can share and something I can coach. And so those were outcomes that were beyond even what I would have expected, Zach. So I guess I say all that to say that we think we have something now that we're going to plan to build upon in the coming year, and setting forth somewhat of a flywheel effect for our system, because one of the other things that happened was the word sort of spread that we only had certain schools participating because they had phase 2 and phase 3 interns from our college partner. And other folks were like, well, I want that. When is that coming to my school? And so I said, okay, well, how about the people who participated in year 1 will help coach the rest of the leadership of the system on effortful thinking for year 2, while we dive into a different topic for Learning Science Consortium year 2. But I don't think Jim and I think that it ends with Hood College and Frederick County Public Schools.
Wow. Well, this kind of talk gets me pretty excited because it's so needed. I even think when you were saying that about the effortful thinking strand, like how much like teachers get together or recruited to do curriculum adoptions, right? And they come in and they're looking at the materials in the same way that you just said the principal didn't know what to say in the classroom. They don't know what to say when they come to adopting materials, or they don't know what to say when it comes to creating common assessments, right? And so it's just needed, I think, to take back this profession to be focused in on teaching and learning and the core mission of schools. However, I do want to mention something that Meg said to me. I want her give her a chance to comment on this. You kept saying evidence informed and equity driven, and actually I've never heard anyone be as eloquent as you is describing the interplay between those two. Can I give you a shot maybe to describe what you mean by that?
Sure. I'm really extremely proud of Frederick County Public Schools for stepping out and actually not just saying that, but actually writing that on our documents and actually attempting to live it. And I say attempting because it's a work in progress. We are constantly lensing practices and purchases and processes to see if we truly are equity driven and evidence informed. But we certainly believe that equity for every student every day is really important to us. But we know that one of the main ways we get to equity is by looking at evidence and really understanding the interplay between what research tells us about how our children learn and how our adults learn, and the recognition of the unique conditions that every classroom has and the context that we have, both as a public school system and our student achievement levels, those kinds of things. But then that third piece of being evidence informed is the professional expertise and experience of the educators who have such a stake in the process. And I think, you mentioned passionately, Zach, about the profession and, focusing the profession. And one of the things I will say is that I think this kind of work raises the professionalism of our teachers. You can see the pride in all of our educators as when they learn something that they know is making a difference, and they see it and they want to then help pass that along to someone else. And so our focus is, are we focusing on what we know, and is it evidence informed? And does that close the gaps of equity that have existed historically for students? And I'm a believer that you can't talk about equity without talking about instruction. And so again, what is it that happens in those day-to-day conversations and lessons in the classroom? Those are just as powerful equity moves as the things that we do to set the conditions for learning, in terms of our cultural competency and our anti-racism and the other things. So all of it goes together to make us equity driven and evidence informed.
Yeah, and Meg and I talked about this quite early on in the process, and I, I had been thinking and had written a couple of things about this, and especially it struck me when I first moved to the US that the discourse here is very much treats equity and inequity at the system level, which it absolutely rightly should. But I would advocate, in addition to acknowledging the sort of big sweeping societal and local forces that shape inequity and injustice in our system, to also pay attention to a kind of instructional inequity. And that is to say, this is exactly what you were naming, Zach, about the stuff of walking into a classroom. You walk into a classroom, you should be asking yourself, who in here is getting to think? Mm-hmm. And if it and we know enough about the Matthew effect to know that the more thinking that you get to do, and the more prior knowledge that you can acquire and encode, you're only going to get richer in the game of learning. And so when I think about inequity, I do think about it at that big picture, systemic, structural level. But I think we ought to be paying more attention to how it plays out in the day-to-day lives and activities of teachers and students. And again, to my earlier point, the only way to do that is to not shy away from the nuance of what happens when teachers and students huddle around content in the four walls of a classroom.
Perfect. We are coming to the end of this episode. Where can we learn more about your work? And I'm sure people are going to want to inquire into your, into how to get in contact with you and your stuff. Jim, let's start with you. I know you've got a bunch of things coming out.
Yeah, thank you. Plug central here. So I will be speaking at I'll be the keynote actually at Research Ed Denver, which is coming up. Meg, you're my agent. When is Research Ed Denver?
I'm
October?
No, it is November 9th, Saturday, November 9th.
There you go. I'm really on top of these things. So November 9th, Research Ed Denver, I'll be keynoting there. Mentioned earlier, the Paradoxes book, we will be working on that for the remainder of this year, so expect that early 25. But the book I'm working on at the moment that I'm really excited about, and which the timing is perfect, Zach, because I literally will be putting the full stop on the final sentence and sending it to the publisher this weekend. So by fall, there is a new book coming out called Mental Models, and it is an attempt to codify some of these principles of learning science that we've been discussing. But rather than staying at the kind of largely abstract and not so applicable level, we've tried to render each of these principles into a mental model. In other words, here is a way of thinking about this principle in a way that you can hold in your hand and use. And so each of the chapters will drill into a different aspect of learning science and try to refine our mental models around how each of those work in our daily choices. And as far as the other stuff is concerned, you can reach out to me by Googling my name with Harvard Graduate School of Education. You can reach out to me by Googling my name with Deans for Impact, or you can bug me on Twitter at HealJim, which is my personal favorite.
And can you give us, because I was at a presentation of yours about this mental models book, and other books have distilled teaching down into 5 steps or into 1-pagers, or it codified them into fun names. Can you give us an example of a mental model that you're talking about?
Yeah, thank you. I was trying to be relatively brief because you said we were wrapping up, but I'm glad that, because yeah, they're hard to explain without an example. So for instance, one of the chapters is about the importance of prior knowledge, and how we come to understand new ideas only with reference to what we already know. And so if you are somebody that wants to prompt another person or a student or even someone you know to understand something new, it pays to be able to ground that in what they already know. And so the mental model in this case, and again, they rely somewhat on a kind of figurative representation. So the mental model in this case that's designed to really make the concept sticky and usable is what we call the rock climber. So in the mental model of a rock climber, the foothold is the prior knowledge that that person is already in possession of. The handhold that they are reaching for is the new knowledge that you want to bridge them towards. And the distance that spans between the two are the steps that you need to take, in this case as the educator, to invite them to connect what they already know to what they might come to know. And we use that sort of central mental model metaphor as the jumping off point for then examining, well, what would that actually look like? How could you do that? What would a specific worked examples of that mental model at work consist of? But the aim being that it is in large part the mental model that sticks with you, and by extension, you're able to recall and retrieve some of the more nuanced aspects of what that particular principle and others might consist of. It's our humble attempt at trying to see the world of these ideas in a grain of sand, and to present them in ways that are manageable and accessible and usable without stripping them of their nuance and richness. You can still hold it in your hand, but it is in some way, hopefully, a kind of enriched uranium version of what these principles actually look like in use.
And ironically, you get basically attach. You just use the prior knowledge example. You get to attach what you already know about the rock climber to this new concept, right? I think
Exactly.
it's gonna be an awesome book. Meg, you get to pretty much have the last word until I swoop in and have the last word. So go ahead.
Um, I'm around. If people want to find me, they can find me at megvertebrae@gmail.com, or on X, Twitter at megvertebrae. Everyone asks me about that, and I'm a multiple back surgery survivor, so vertebrae are really important to me. But also, they are delicate, but they are strong. And so, to me, that was a perfect analogy for what I want to be in the world. And So really excited to speak to anybody about, what it is that we do and how we could help them to move forward. And I'm so excited about Jim's book, particularly the mental models with Rebecca Berlin, because I think it's going to be a fabulous resource. And the two of them are a dynamic duo, and I can't wait to read it.
Oh, excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, both of you, Jim and Meg. Listeners, thank you for tuning in to Progressively Incorrect. We're coming towards the end of the season, but it has been exciting. All of my heroes in education have been on this show of late. So thank you so much, everybody. Take care.